Jeremy Rifkin might describe you as a green gadfly, one of the environmental visionaries of both the late 20th and early 21st century. Jeremy is the author of The Third Industrial Revolution, a new book about the energy internet revolution that will save our society. Jeremy, thank you again for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
Thank you.
Jeremy, it's in some ways a very uplifting book. And yesterday we broadcast your interview about the book itself. I'd like to talk today about perhaps a little bit more of a depressing element to the book, which is how in some ways you turned your back on America and focused your energies, to excuse the pun, on Europe. At the beginning of the book, you say you didn't go west, you went east. And your whole initiative in terms of building this third industrial revolution seems to be focused on Europe rather than America. Given that you are American and are based, I think, on the East Coast, why did you do this?
You know, I've been involved in this whole question of transitioning to a new energy regime since 1973, when we had the first protests against the rising oil prices during the OPEC crisis in 1973. And as a young man, I remember we put together a great protest in Boston, the Great Boston Oil Party, on the 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party. And 20,000 young people in a blizzard came out on the docks during that 200th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, throwing empty oil barrels into the wharf and to the waters there, and protesting high oil prices during the OPEC crisis. And here we are now in 2011. It's clear to me that the initiative has moved from America to Europe. And, Europe is the laboratory. Now, a lot of folks will roll their eyes and say, well, isn't Europe a museum, a nice place to visit? It's not a player. What we forget is that the European Union is a political space, and the 27 member states of the European Union have a higher GDP than the 50 states of the United States Union. It's the leading power in the world, and it's the leading exporting power in the world. And more importantly, the reason I went over there over the last 11 years and spent most of my time with heads of state in the EU there is they're coming up with the new ideas. They're asking the tough questions about the future of the human race, the meaning of human nature. What is our journey here on this planet? How do we build a sustainable, peaceful society? I wish that were the case here in the States too. And you know what amazes me the most?
So you're saying, Jeremy, that we're not asking those questions in America?
I think we are. I think we're now squabbling and fighting with each other and moving to the political extremes, and we're not focused on the big questions. We're in a very seminal turning point here. We've had two events in the last 3 years that signal an end game for the industrial way of life based on fossil fuels. The first, of course, was July 2008, when oil hit $147 a barrel. And the prices for everything that we buy went through the roof, from groceries to pharmaceutical products, because they're all made out of crude oil. And purchasing power plummeted. And in July 2008, the entire global economy shut down. What I'm suggesting, and Europe understands, is that was the economic earthquake. The financial collapse of the market 60 days later was the aftershock. Europe is starting to deal with the earthquake. We're still dealing with the aftershock. And every time we try to regrow this global economy, at the same rate we were growing before July 2008, now that China and India is in the game with a third of the human race, there's just simply too much demand pressure globally against limited crude oil supplies. And every time we try to regrow, oil prices go up, all the other prices on the supply chain go up, purchasing power goes down, and we collapse. And that's what's happening today. We're right on the cusp of a second collapse. Brent crude oil is over 100 a barrel. Basic products are going up in price. People are stopped buying. And every time we try to restart this engine, we're going to see a short growth period, then collapse. Short growth, collapse in 4-year cycles or less. This is an end game. And then secondly, we've got climate change. It's now affecting in real time agricultural output and infrastructure. This is the entropy bill. The engineers listening, watching this understand you cannot escape the second law of thermodynamics. We are paying the entropy bill for 2 industrial revolutions based on fossil fuels. So we've spewed so much spent CO2 into the atmosphere that the planet's heating up, and now we're facing a species crisis, not simply a structural crisis.
Jeremy, you've had a lot of success convincing European leaders, from Angela Merkel to David Cameron to Prince Albert of Monaco, this narrative. But you say that President Obama is missing the story. He's missing the narrative. Talk to me a little bit about that, how and why he is missing this story.
You know, it's a complete mystery to me, because I assume that the internet president, who is a generational shift, would have completely understood the tremendous opportunities of bringing internet communication technology with energies, so that a generation that voted for him, that grew up empowered to creating their own information, he could say to them, now we're going to create the possibilities of you creating your own energy and creating a sustainable world and creating millions of jobs in day one and thousands of new businesses. He didn't do it. His heart was in the right place. I truly believe he wanted a green economy, but he didn't have this narrative. He didn't understand how communication energy comes together to create a new nervous system. He didn't understand that you have to bring all the components together, these 5 pillars, and together they are the technology revolution. And what he did, if you watch closely, he took every opportunity to talk about a green initiative in isolation. He'd visit a battery factory over here, or he'd visit a solar factory over there, and he would give us a list, like a policy list, a laundry list of siloed, piloted projects. And so the result is we spent billions of dollars of US tax money, and we didn't get much of value for it because he didn't connect the dots. You have to think like an engineer. You have to think systemically. You have to connect these 5 pillars. And when you connect them, renewable energy, converting the buildings to your own power plants, putting in storage like hydrogen so you can store the energy, then creating an energy internet so we can share it across continents, then plugging in the transport. It's when you connect them that we have a new economic period of history. That is a mega technology platform. He has not gotten it, but it's even more serious. And I hope I'm not stepping on toes here, but I'll give you an example.
On toes. That's all we do at TechCrunch TV.
Well, all right. Okay, I'm going to put my foot into my mouth here, but this really happened. The energy companies are very powerful in the United States. They're a very powerful lobby, and they like to keep centralized power intact. And this is true in Washington, too. President Obama and Mr. Chu, the Department of Energy Secretary, they did come up with a plan. It was completely different than the plan we have in Europe. Their plan was to have big solar parks and wind parks set up in the Midwest and the West, and then put in a high voltage line, unidirectional smart grid, to send all that green electricity to the eastern areas where the big urban populations are. So they do want a smart grid, but they don't want it distributed. They want it centralized. Well, guess what? The eastern governors and the mid-Atlantic governors said, no way. If we're going to raise everyone's electricity price, we want to make sure we create our own green electricity in our buildings, in our communities, in our regions, so we can create jobs and businesses. Then we want a distributed grid so we can share our surpluses in energy with everyone else. So again, I think we have centralized top-down thinking in Washington, and the green economy is all about distributed, collaborative arrangements and lateral power. Europe understands that.
Jeremy, in the fact that you are beginning to successfully institute this revolution in Europe through your own personal relationships with heads of state. That's not very lateral, is it?
You know, it works on both levels, because you absolutely have to have buy-in at the federal level, in the EU, the Brussels level, the federal level, and the local level, because that's where you create the incentives. But it's the local level where you bring industry, government, and civil society together to create the nodes, the 5-pillar nodes. I'll give you an example of why you need federal level support. The reason Europe's taking off with this is they've introduced feed-in tariffs. So everyone's electricity goes up just slightly. You don't even notice it on your bill. But the monies they collect in a country then allow them to give someone premium. If you decide to convert your small factory or your home with a huge photovoltaic power plant, you'll get premium, and that is more money for sending your green energy back to the grid than the normal electricity on the grid. This encourages early adoption. It encourages a runaway in technology applications and new technology innovations. In Germany alone, when they put in this feed-in tariff, listen to this, my fellow Americans, 250,000 jobs created instantly within a few years in the green energy industry. That matched all the other jobs and all the other energy industries combined, even though it's only 10% of the energy. So feed-in tariffs are critical, and that means you have to have some involvement at the regional and national level, and you have to set up some standards and incentives and some goals. But ultimately, it has to be community to community.
Jeremy, there's a large audience of TechCrunch entrepreneurs, perhaps the largest audience you'll find of American-based technology entrepreneurs. What would you say to them? How can they help initiate the 5 pillars of the third industrial revolution in America?
The tech community in the United States can really move on this quickly, but what they have to understand is the new killer apps are the technologies that allow us to deepen each of the component pillars: the renewable energies, the conversions of building the power plants, the storage, the hydrogen storage, the energy internet, and the plug-in logistics and transport. Deepen each of those pillars. But then the other technologies that are crucial are the connection technologies between the pillars, the new IT applications that allow us to make connections between the 5 pillars to create the synergies. It's the synergies that create a new multiplier effect and create all sorts of new business models. And I'll give you one example, and it's a perfect example. The power and utility companies. Of course, they weren't too happy with this new idea in Europe when we first created it. They said, we like to control power from the top. We like to control transmission of electricity to the end user. And we like to sell electrons. We don't like this model. Over a period of years, we won the utility companies over. Not all of them, but many of them. And we said, here's the new model. And all of your TechCrunch people or internet folks, they're going to absolutely understand this intuitively at the get-go. We said to the utility companies, get used to it. Millions and millions of people are going to create their own green electricity. It's already starting in Europe.
Very briefly, Jeremy.
All right.
Because it's the end now. Very briefly.
Then we're going to create our own electricity. It's going to get cheaper and cheaper, like cell phones and like personal computers. The utility company's new mission is to manage energy flows with clients, corporate clients, and find ways to reduce the energy use embedded in the products and logistics so that corporate clients can stay afloat, increase their productivity, reduce their energy needs, and then they can save back and share their profits and productivity with the utility companies. If the utility companies don't do this, many of them will go out of business. We're already seeing thousands of startup companies and hundreds of them successful who are aggregating green energy, and they're then finding ways to manage that energy with people on microgrids and across logistic lines. So you may see an entire new business where the IT and internet companies began to merge with energy and began to aggregate a flat online energy internet across entire countries.
Jeremy, finally, in under a minute, what can people do politically here if they agree with you, if they care about this third industrial revolution? And you need to be very brief here, please.
We have to tell the story of this third industrial revolution. That's why I wrote the book. These 5 pillars have to become part of our narrative. What's missing in America is we've lost our imagination. And I see Mr. Jobs, of course, just passed away. He was a turning point. What made America great is our ability to tell a story about the future that's so compelling, so vivid, that we will rush in, gamble it all, because we know that tomorrow is going to be a better day. We need Madison Avenue and Silicon Valley and Hollywood and people all over America to engage in this new narrative and roll up our sleeves and say, how can we use the internet revolution now and complete it by joining in with renewable energy so we can have power to the people, democratize energy, create distributed capitalism for the country.
On that uplifting note, Jeremy Rifkin, gadfly, author, activist, I want to thank you so much for appearing on TechCrunch TV.
Thanks for the opportunity.